Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm administration, find out whether you've been purged from the rolls. We've got it all set up for you out there. So we don't want anybody to leave here and not be registered to vote. Thank you for coming this evening for this important forum on the Ohio State Report Card. The League of Women Voters currently does not have a position on school report cards and high-stakes testing, but our local league, the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, is in the process of establishing a committee to make a preliminary exploration of this issue. And we'd like to thank our sponsors tonight, Cleveland Heights-University Heights PTA Council, Case Western Reserve University Siegal Lifelong Learning Program, and Cleveland.com, Plain Dealer, and our corporate sponsor, First Interstate Limited. I'd like to bring to your attention other forums that we're going to be sponsoring in the near future. One of them is on gun violence on September 12th at the Tinker Center, and another one on September 13th on the importance of voting. There are flyers in the back on the table, and feel free to. There are other events that I haven't mentioned that are worth your while as well, but I just mentioned the ones on the east side. I'd like to introduce Patrick O'Donnell. Patrick has been a reporter at the Plain Dealer since 1992 and has covered the Cleveland School District and statewide education policy since 2011. He's a resident of Cleveland Heights and lives an easy walk from this high school. Patrick?
Hi, thank you very much. So we're going to be talking about state report cards, what they ought to do, what they do show, what's working right and what's working wrong with them, and what we might want to do about them in the future. We've got a few panelists here. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves to you briefly.
Hi, I'm Chad Aldis. I'm a Vice President for Ohio Policy and Advocacy at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Fordham, if you're not familiar with our work, is a 501c3 nonprofit that works mostly on education issues.
Hi, Talisa Dixon, Superintendent here at Cleveland Heights-Univeristy Heights School District.
Stephen Dyer, Education Policy Fellow at Innovation Ohio. Like Mr. Aldis, it's Mr. Aldis's group. It's a 501c3 public policy think tank. We are a little more diversified. We don't just do education, although that's a big part of our portfolio. Prior to that, I served in the Ohio House for 4 years, where I was chair of the primary secondary education subcommittee on the House Finance and Appropriations Committee. See, I say it fast. It proves I was on it. And before that, I was a reporter at the Akron Beacon Journal, where I reported on lots of education issues over the years. So this has been near and dear to my heart for going on 20 years now.
Hi, I'm Lisa Woods, and I am a state school board member for District 5, which covers 4 counties and parts of 4 more counties. And I'm also a mom of 5, and I have 2 in school.
So excellent. So testing and report cards, they've really escalated and became a lot more prominent when the federal government passed the No Child Left Behind law many years ago. At least publicly, that was really a civil rights law, with the testing and grades meant to show if schools were giving adequate and equal education opportunities to everybody. How report cards have been used and viewed has changed over time. So we now have an accountability system that makes a lot of judgments about schools. Beyond just measuring the equality of education kids receive. We have grades being used to decide whether schools are good or bad. We have results that depend greatly on the socioeconomic conditions of its students. And we have penalties or crucial interventions, depending on your position, depending on how well schools score on the test. What I'd like to do with the panel here today is kind of break this up into 4 kind of groups of areas about the report cards before we move into questions from all of you for about the last half hour of tonight. What I'd like to focus on first is what's the point of the report card? What is the philosophy behind having them? What do we want them to show? What should they actually mean? We'll put aside the problems and the specifics about the report cards today, but in an ideal world, what should a report card show? You have thoughts, Chad?
Nope, no thoughts. No. School report cards, I think the number one overriding factor, and again, based on Patrick's instructions, I won't go into the pros and cons and how well each of these things happen, but the theory is, the first thing is transparent information about the performance and how schools are doing. Secondly, I think that the importance of this information varies by stakeholder, and I think it means something different to everyone. For parents, I think the critical thing, especially in a state that has a multitude of school choice options, is this school a good fit for my child? For schools and communities, identifying areas of strength where a school's really doing well, maybe something that can be replicated or copied over a successful program, copied into another building, or areas of weakness that need to be addressed. And then finally, for policymakers, an opportunity to identify when additional resources might be necessary if a school is struggling and isn't making progress, or when policies need to be changed, because some great, wonderful policy, at least that looked good in Columbus, when it's actually implemented, isn't making a difference for kids. And so those are, I think, the main reason is transparency, and then the importance of it to various stakeholder groups.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good answer. I agree with that. I think it definitely should be a clear picture of what that looks like, and also a clear and accurate picture. So if it's going to inform stakeholders on choices, that should be a clear picture about what that information they provide, and provide the information that's relevant to all stakeholders. So I agree with you, but just make sure that it's relevant to those stakeholders in those communities. I think that's very important.
Yeah, for me, an ideal report card would tell me as a parent, me as a stakeholder, me as a policymaker, do kids in this school or this district enjoy learning, and when they're done with their education, are they going to be more likely to be lifelong learners? That's kind of the bottom line for me. I don't know if we could talk about how you measure that, but if I had a magic wand and could wave it and would create the perfect report card system, it would tell every parent, every child, every teacher, everyone in the world, this school, this building has a lot of kids in it who end up, after their experience, liking to learn more than when they entered. And that's kind of the bottom line for me.
I think the report card in the beginning was for accountability. Who it should be used for is a little bit of everybody, but I would say mostly parents. Parents want to know how their schools are doing. Parents that are moving are looking where they may want to move to and what school would be best for their child. I think the report card should also help teachers understand how their class and school is doing competitively with other schools in Ohio. But the bottom line, I think, is mostly parents need to understand what the report card is and how they can use it.
So do any of you think that a single report card can serve all of those different constituencies and give them the information they need to make their decisions, or do we need to break it out into multiple different ones for different purposes? Is that
Just go down the
any
line,
of you? Any of you?
I think you can, but you've got to be willing to actually go out and try to measure the things that really matter. I mean, the issue with the current report card. I mean, I don't mean to. Let me just jump in the deep end right now. The issue with the current report card is basically it's based on standardized test scores, which measure essentially, one aspect of a student's life in the classroom. It doesn't measure love of learning. There are assessment tools that can measure love of learning aspects, curiosity, those kinds of things. It doesn't measure, and the effect. We try to get student growth in there, but a kid could test better the second half of the year, not just because of their experience in the classroom, but because they're suddenly in the cool crowd, or they got a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or something. There are a whole bunch of reasons why things are going on. So I think that the determining whether a school is appropriate for your child, I think, should be based on more than a couple of test scores that represent 4 or 5 days of 4 or 5 days of a student's experience out of 180. So I think, I think it's possible to do it in one, but you got to make sure you're measuring the right stuff and not just a small, narrow sliver of an experience that a kid's having. The report card, when people ask me about the report card and how important it is, I say, well, at this point, it's everything, but it also tells you very little. So that's.
Do any of you think that
it.
there's an actual objective way to measure whether a school is good or bad?
But I want to piggyback on what he said first, please. I think if we think about the experiences we want for our kids and what parents expect to happen in the classroom, in school, you don't get that from the report card. You get one day that you're asking kids to do a task, and then you get data from that. And then we are characterizing and categorizing our schools based on that one day, that one point of time. But if we go back and say, what do we want our kids to learn? What do we expect that learning to look like? And then how do we assess that? That's something different. If we're going to use standardized testing, let's use standardized tests to monitor and diagnose. And I think that's what standardized tests are good for. Where should our kids be? How do we get them there? How do we monitor to make sure that they are learning? And then use some other type of measure to see exactly what our students are doing. What does that experience look like? And then how can we share that experience with our stakeholders so that they understand that there's something meaningful happening in our schools every day?
I mean, is there an objective way is there an actual objective way that you guys believe in to show whether a school is doing a good job or a bad job? And if so, what is it?
The Justice Potter test.
That's not objective.
I know it when I see it.
That's that's subjective. So what do we know that's objective?
Well, again, grades are subjective too. I teach freshman writing at the University of Akron, so I teach writing, and a lot of my grade is, well, it's good writing. Why is it good writing? Well, you're not dangling things, and you've got some good grammar, but it's also how you put together ideas, how you organize them. Can you turn a phrase? And that stuff's kind of subjective. There's subjective and objective data in every assessment we make of our kids all the time. Objectively, I don't like the idea of my kid running across the street. But subjectively, I don't mind if he's running across the street to get his bike so that it doesn't get stolen. I think that there are. I don't think it's an end-sum game here. I don't think you have to have a perfectly objective, this school sucks kind of analysis. But I do think that the data that we collect should be meaningful so that people understand that what the overall experience is going to be in this school. Everybody's been talking about ECOT lately. There are kids who liked ECOT and learned something at ECOT. Not enough to justify $1 billion, but I always tell this story too. My favorite teacher in high school was despised by probably 90% of the school, but I loved that teacher. So it's very subjective determining what's a great education for everyone. But I do think that the report card needs to do a better job of getting a more holistic picture of what the experience is in that building, in that school, than it's doing right now. We do have an unwieldy, I agree with Chad on this, we have an unwieldy report card. We need to, but it's not unwieldy because we have a lot of different data points. It's a lot of different ways to slice up the same basic 2 tests.
So Lisa, do you think there is a way to get parents the information they need to know if the schools are doing a good job with their kids?
I do, but if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the question just before that about whether a report card could cover all those different parents, superintendents, teachers, and so forth. I'd like to say yes, it could and should. Does it right now? I would say no. So your next question, go ahead and repeat that again.
Right. So do you think there can be a way in which a report card can get accurate and some objective information to parents so that they can make decisions about whether their school is doing well for their kid? I
do. I think that that we could have things on the report card that parents care about. How we do it is a kind of a different discussion or part. I think, sorry, I'm a little nervous up here.
That's okay.
I think parents want to see different things. And some of the things that we test for, we could show the data, but it doesn't have to be used in the punitive ways that we see is happening now. And that's why I'd like to see more of a dashboard where the subject that parents are looking for are there, and then you can drill down into the data if you're a teacher or a superintendent or somebody that wants to look further into that area.
I actually think that the charter school experience in Ohio kind of teaches us a lot about this, because in a lot of charter schools, their report card data isn't that great, but they're still growing. They're still growing enrollment. And in talking with parents who choose to send their children to charter schools, even if their charter school isn't really highly rated, and by the way, most parents don't really listen to the report card. That's from survey data that's been out there for years. But regardless of that, I think that the experience their child has in the building is incredibly important to the parent. And if the child is having a good experience in the building, they don't really care what the report card says. And I think that's, I think that kind of, the experience of a lot of what's going on in the charter world, where it seems kind of to fly in the face of logic, where you have low-performing schools that are still growing enrollment. That's, I think, a lot of that is the personal experiences that they're having in that building, and frankly, I think that there should be some way of measuring that. I don't know if we're certainly not working on that right now. I don't think, but I think we should.
Okay, Chad.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that. I know we've covered this question, I think, quite a bit already now, but I agree with the superintendent. The idea of sort of monitoring performance, it being, sometimes I think of it as like an annual checkup, sort of like you're going to the doctor, right? It's not the only thing you do. You go to bed on time, you get good sleep, you have a good healthy diet, you get your exercise, but then once a year you go to the doctor and they say, hey, your cholesterol is still a little high, but your blood pressure is great. I see you're working on it. Let's improve still here a little bit there. And I think that is long-term the most effective use of report cards. And that happens at the school level. And then with parents, in terms of their use of the state report card, it's primarily, I think, used as a screening tool when they're switching schools, when they're moving from elementary school to middle school or middle school to high school, to try to get as much information, or when they're moving into the community. But when they're in school, I think it's exactly what Steve said. I love Miss Johnson, my third grade teacher. She's amazing, and that's great. And then they start thinking and hoping they get a certain teacher in fourth grade. And I think that's the parent experience that we hear most about at the school level. So it matters less what your report card says when you're in the building, but I think for people switching or people new or moving into a community, it creates more of a screening mechanism.
All right, so setting aside the accountability issues that arise from low scores, what's right and what's wrong about what report cards tell parents and others about schools now?
Well, I think we focus on what's, what they don't tell us and how negative they are. But there is a lot of really incredible data out there in the current report card. And when I show the data that Ohio has versus what other states have, when I'm going out to conferences and I talk with other folks in other states, they're kind of amazed at how much data we have. We do. I think the report card, because it is unwieldy, but there's a lot of information there. We've got a lot of data to tell us things. I'm not sure how valuable that is the more you slice it down to like the school classroom level. But I think it does give you a good general idea of where things are. But you have to understand there's a huge caveat in that even though there's a huge amount of data, it's basically slicing up the same few test scores that kids get and trying to disaggregate it by income, by race, by other things, and trying to figure out growth. The kids did this well in fall, now they're doing this well in spring, and they get a bone. They get a grade based on the growth, that kind of stuff. But it's still all based on those single test scores. So, I think that sometimes parents can be confused by all this data that's out there, thinking that it's telling you a ton of stuff about what's going on in the building, when in fact it's just using sophisticated methods to tell you different things about the same limited data set. Right.
So, Superintendent, what do you like and not like about the report card?
Well, what I don't like is that it does not give a clear picture of what our school system is and what we're offering.
In what sense?
What our classroom teachers are doing and how well they're teaching and how well they're instructing, how the district is aligning the resources to assist our teachers and assist our parents. It does not give a clear picture of that. It does not give a clear picture of what the resources that the community has offered with our cities and our other officials in our libraries, those resources that we are bringing to the table to help our students and our families. And the negative side of that is giving us grades that are instead placing a judgment on our communities. And I think that is so wrong, that we give a grade on something for a one point of time of data that is being collected, and then our community is judged or characterized by that one point in time. So I think that is definitely negative.
So, at a certain point, kids have to learn their math. They have to learn to read and write. They have to know their history.
Correct.
They have to know their science. So do the tests not show whether the kids know those skills? And at what point do we judge whether the kids are leaving a school with those skills or not?
Asking me?
Sure.
Okay. So first, I believe that the report card first of all, every community's students are made up of various students from various backgrounds. So
yes.
If we are measuring growth, how well are our students that are coming to us from various backgrounds? Cleveland Heights would get an A every single time, because I know that we are growing our students because they're coming to us from various backgrounds, so we're doing well. But if you're going to measure how well my students are doing to another community that does not have the same demographics or students that are coming from the same socioeconomic status, then I don't think that's fair to that community that's working hard with the students that they have to make sure that those students are being successful. Our success, we need to define, our community is defining what we believe our graduates should have. The state comes up with these other measures that they believe that everyone in the state should be able to do, and we don't disagree with that. We think it's important that our students achieve mastery. Mastery is very important to us. We want our students to be prepared graduates. We want them to be ready for college and career. It is their choice, but we want them to be ready. That is important to us. But if we're looking at a report card that's going to judge my district based on students who may come to my district the day before a test and I've not had the opportunity to make sure that they have had access to the curriculum that we have chosen to give to our students, and then we're yet judged on that. That is totally not fair to my community or any other community.
When districts, and this is for you and for other folks as well. So if a district has a lot of poor kids or kids with a lot of socioeconomic problems and their test scores are low, should we read anything into the low scores that they get? I mean, I've heard lots of different theories, as in it's a representation of the kids your kids would go to school with. It has a representation of the standards that parents hold their kids to. It could indicate that the teachers, you may not have the most experienced teachers who aren't able to convey things as well to your kids. I mean, the bottom line would be that the kids are not learning the material as well as the kids in the other communities. What do you take from that? Should you take anything from that?
Well, I think it's very difficult to divorce the powerful predictor that wealth is on standardized test scores. It's just, if any time you look at test scores and and poverty rates, it's almost a one-to-one correlation. Not to get into the weeds on statistical analysis, but so it's just to give you an example, the performance index score that's developed in Ohio is out of 120 points. Don't ask why, but it is, okay? I think the highest score of any school district in the state is somewhere in the 1-teens. I think it's like 114 or something like that. Of course, it's a very wealthy district. It's like Ottawa Hills or something. But getting like a 100 or a 110 in Solon may not be as impressive as Cleveland Heights-University Heights get an 85, and it's not because the kids in Cleveland Heights-University Heights aren't capable of doing great things. It's because the state tests, the standardized tests, are inherently tied to income. Now, there are tests that don't correlate as closely with wealth as these do. For those of you who are interested, go read Robert Sternberg's work on different intelligences and how he's come up with a way to test that isn't affected by this. But be that as it may, I think it's very difficult to divorce those two factors, and it's not necessarily the kids who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, don't know their math, don't know their reading, or something like that. It's the tests themselves, for whatever reason, and we can get into those if you want, but they're just not geared toward kids from all backgrounds. And so, the kids who are wealthy, the wealthier, the whiter you are, the better you do on the test. I mean, that's just kind of the way it's been. So that's one of the major problems with the current structure of the report card.
So Chad, how strictly should we hold schools to actual performance accountability?
Well, I do want to, and I'm happy to answer that question. But first, you asked a little bit earlier, and we didn't quite make it around on the strengths and weaknesses of our current framework, which I think is important because it's sort of because there are both strengths and weaknesses, and I think we've heard some of the strengths that Steve mentioned earlier, the amount of data available, but specifically, the whole reason for No Child Left Behind and the reason annual testing remained in federal law during ESSA, which happened just a couple of years ago, is because of the ability to show how low income and traditionally disadvantaged students they wanted to make sure, and civil rights groups campaigned on this at the federal level to make sure testing remained a part of it so we could have great data. In Ohio, not only can you get various demographic subgroups, you also get gifted students with disabilities, and the whole concept there is to make sure we have a clear picture of whether students are are at grade level, are proficient, are passing their assessments. And we can get into the debate about assessments and how well they do, and whether the assessment instruments themselves are biased, or whether the achievement gap and the words gap and everything, and the preparedness gap at the beginning of school causes that, or whether it's the test instrument itself. I think that's a very, very tough question. But then the weaknesses of it, and I think the weaknesses will lead to some of the discussion points about how fair the system is, which was getting to your question. Ohio does something really well in that it has one of the most robust measures of student growth or learning gains in the country. And it's called value added. And it has its critics as well, which I think it's fair to have that debate and discussion. But for the states that have attempted this, Ohio's system has the most factors. It actually uses each student as his or her own control group to see whether they did better or worse than would have been expected. Now, we can still work on that, and we should work on it to make it better. But the idea that Ohio actually tries to determine whether every student is actually making the progress that statistically you would expect them to do is a step forward that a lot of states haven't had. But the weaknesses, and this is something that Fordham has heavily criticized the state's report cards for, is right now the state report cards, the way, and we'll be having an overall grade coming in September for the first time in about 5 years in Ohio. Schools and school districts will get an overall single letter grade. Our biggest complaint about that, because we are supportive of the letter grade, is that right now the way they're calculating it, it's going to correlate too much with demographics and socioeconomic status. And that's because out of the factors that are in the state report card, probably 70 to 80% are correlated with demographics, and 20 to 30% schools serving low-income students have a chance to get a good grade on. And that needs to be reweighted. That needs to be rebalanced. And I think that's one of the primary weaknesses. They can tell you a lot, but you got to be careful that it's not just giving you a status measure of the school. And I'm sorry for being so long-winded.
No. So follow up for you. So we've got, obviously we have the growth and achievement measures, right? So achievement measures are the ones that tend to correlate more with the socioeconomic status of students. Students start further behind, so even if they grow at the same pace as others, they don't ever catch up. So you would like to see growth weighted more?
Yeah, I would really love to see growth weighted more, especially in the 3rd through 8th grade levels. Because you get kids that are far behind, and schools do their very best with them. And if they're making progress, we should recognize that excellence and try to copy it, and not slap them with a label. Anybody who's showing learning gains of a year and a half, 2 years, shouldn't be labeled with a D or an F, which our current report card does too often, but should be praised, and we should be learning from them. But at the high school level, I would, and I don't know what the exact percentage is, because anybody who tells you it's science rather than a bit of art, it's more like medicine, trying to figure out the best way of getting the information. At the high school level, I would shift more toward proficiency, because when our kids get out of 12th grade, they've got to be ready to go to work or go to college or something. So, and I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it would, yeah. So, but in K through 8, I would definitely focus more on growth.
So, Lisa, you had a lot of concerns about the report card earlier this year, and you proposed a bunch of changes. So, I'd like to give you a chance to say what do you like about the current report card, and what do you most dislike that prompted you to seek some of those changes?
Thanks, Pat. I'd like to start with some of the issues that are issues. Okay. Number one, when I got out in the field and talked to superintendents and met people in the different school districts, I found that the report card was very hard to understand. The different measures can, especially with a through F grade, is hard to understand, and I find that the A, D, C causes an emotional reaction when someone looks at it and says, oh my gosh, this school's only getting a C in this area. And it doesn't show the data as to how we can compare it to other schools, and maybe other schools that have the same kind of demographics and so forth. So I think the letter grade is a real problem. I think that if we had the dashboard and just raw data that people could look at would be a lot more helpful. I'm actually a critic of the value added. I haven't really met anyone on the outside that understands value added. It's complicated, and it's just not reasonable for parents and common people to understand what that means to them and to their child. We have another measurement coming up, which is absenteeism. Now, I think absenteeism is very, very important. We know that children that miss school at early ages, say before 3rd grade, are likely to not do as well in high school. Well, this is true. But to ding the school because of absenteeism is wrong, because that's really the parents' duty to get their kids to school. So if we're going to use absenteeism as a measurement for our schools, it should be, how do they handle absenteeism? Do they call parents within the first hour when the child doesn't show up? And what's the next step and the next step? To me, that would make sense, and then I could trust that school to know that, that it's doing what it needs to do to let me know if my child is absent. But you can't blame the school if there's a problem in the community. What if a community is now suddenly plagued with, say, the opiate problem, and kids are missing school? That's really not the school's fault, and they may be trying real hard to get those students to come. But ultimately, it shouldn't be the school's fault.
Okay, so let's actually just take each of you can say yes or no. A to F grades, yes or no?
No.
No.
Yes.
Okay, so.
No, oh, no, I'm sorry.
All right.
No.
So Superintendent, why no?
Why no to A to F?
Why no on A to F grades?
I don't think we should be graded at all. Not
You
in
grade
that way.
students.
Yeah.
We should grade you too.
Yeah. I think there should be some evidence that show that our students are reaching mastery, that they are learning. But I don't like the way the system is currently set up. I agree that the value added, we show growth. Our communities are different. And there must be a way to recognize that our communities are different. Our students are coming to us from very different entryway points, and we have to recognize that and develop something that acknowledges that. And what we have now does not work, and the changes in the system, I think, does not help in a sense, because we kind of know what they've done. If you have a system, how can I say? If you have a system that is going to give more credence to students of poverty, is that the answer? Is that the right way? If we focus on closing an achievement gap, is that the right focus? Or is the focus in making sure that students have we're meeting our students where they are, we're making sure that our students have the opportunities, we're closing those opportunity gaps, we're making sure we have expectations that all of our students that come into our schools graduate and are ready for college and a career in all of our schools across our state. To continue down this pathway, I think, is not the right pathway, and I think they should be asking us as superintendents and other school leaders, asking our parents and our community stakeholders what is the right pathway to take. And I don't think we've done a good job in Ohio asking the right people the right questions.
Okay, so Chad, why do you disagree and want the A to F grades?
Yeah, no pressure. I think the teacher's looking at me right now. Right now, Ohio is one of 14 states that use an A to F grading system. What we've found, at least from our perspective, it's very intuitive. People know what it means. There were states that have used terms that are very sort of amorphous. You don't really know whether something's performance is good or bad. Ohio used to have a term called continuous improvement. Well, that sounds okay. It sounds like you're getting better. Of course, you might have been excellent the year before, and your continuous improvement this year, which is not improvement. So I mean, there is a tendency with some of the terminology to use things that are less clear. It's very direct, I guess, in the wording. And then the other thing is, in some studies, it, combined with other reforms, have shown a real push for improvement. Professor Cecilia Rouse at Princeton did a study of Florida's education reforms, and A to F school grading was one of the early things they did. Back in 2003, in NAEP testing, which is done in fourth and eighth grade in reading and math, in every state in the country, and no one preps for it, no one tests, there's no test prep, there's none of that associated with it. Ohio's students, low-income students, white students, black students, all did better than Florida's. Fast forward 15 years, in the 2017 NAEP assessments, Florida students, especially their low-income and minority students, have gained a year and a half to 2 years worth of additional learning in both fourth and eighth grade, and now are ahead of Ohio in every subject category. And A-Def, I am not saying, by the way, that A-Def is the only thing. Anybody who tells you that this is your one solution is trying too hard to sell their thing. They did a whole slate of reforms, but it was one of their suite of efforts they did to try to improve their schools. And right now, if you're a low-income student in the state of Florida, you have a much better chance of being proficient, being on grade level, and having an opportunity. And that is with well-meaning people, teachers, professionals in both states. But sometimes this is one of the things that we think was a major factor. I happened to live in Florida at the time it happened, and when 8F grades first came into effect, there was a huge outcry. And then slowly it became part of our system, and it helped drive improved performance. One of many factors.
My concern with the A through F system is if every district had a real shot at an A, I think it's one thing. But when your test scores and your grades are so heavily based on your demographics, what you're really measuring is poverty in your district. So, I think maybe Cincinnati once got a C under the old system. It was called continuous improvement, but it was a C. And so I think that of the big urban districts, I think they're the only ones that ever got somewhere around there. So again, if you're, I know that University Heights, Cleveland, they all expect that they all shoot for the A, but I think they all know that the deck is severely stacked against them, and in places like Solon and Beechwood, I mean they're pretty confident they're going to get an A. So I don't think it has the proper motivating factor that like when you're in a class and you're taking a course and you have as much a shot as as anyone else, and you put forth the effort and you're supposed to be able to get the A. We could put forth Herculean efforts in some of our school districts around the state, and they wouldn't sniff an A. And I don't know if that's the reward we want to give. And I agree with Chad. We need to work on figuring out ways so that happens. So I think A through F has a real pejorative connotation that we need to watch out for. The other thing that we haven't really brought up, I don't know if we'll ever bring it up, but I think it's important that we talk about, is Ohio has had more local school district levies than any state in the country by a very significant margin.
So funding is a whole other category that will take a whole evening to go into.
But when you're giving out C's and D's, it's very difficult to pass levies, which then makes it very difficult for school districts to improve. So I think there's a in Ohio especially, where you've got all of these local levies going on the ballot every other year, it seems. I think there's a special duty on the state to make sure that the grades aren't just serving to measure poverty and actually measure academic excellence in the school district.
So we've got a couple proposals down in Columbus and a couple discussions going on in Columbus. One at the state school board and through the Department of Education, and one at the state legislature about changing report cards. What do each of you want to see to change them? What are the main changes you want to see? What do you think the best way of making the report card better is? Lisa, you had a whole bunch of ideas.
Well, my idea really is to scrap and rebuild. I don't think the purpose of why we had the report card was probably well intended, but we're having terrible repercussions. We are.
I mean, are you happy with the process that's going at the department and the board now? You were unhappy at one point.
It certainly isn't quick enough because there's schools struggling, and especially the ones that are getting D's and F's. I mean, they're looking at takeovers, and some of these schools are very impressive. They have some of the most challenging areas and kids, and they love these kids. They're doing the best they can, and I think that's what really should be. If you're going to rate the school, it should be how they handle what they have, and not the scores that the kids give. We need a little bit of both, and we need to have accountability, but the way it's coming out is not advantageous to us.
Okay. If you could change anything, Superintendent, about the report card, what would be the one thing you would want? You would tell Ms. Woods to change, right, and you tell your state rep to change.
Scrap and rebuild it.
I agree. Scrap and rebuild. Just for example, the report card is going to be released on September 13th.
Right.
With the letter grade. We've started school. So what do we do after we get it? What are we going to do? We're going to get this report card. We don't know what the grade is. It's going to be in an uproar. Okay, now, and what if we had a levy on the ballot? What if people wanted to move to our community, and they're going to make their decision based on that? So the timing of it, if you're going to get some meaningful information and you're going to give it to school districts, I think it's important that you give it give us those results in a timely fashion so we can do something about it. Giving it to us on September 13th with what? Then what? So it's now what, then what? I think that we need to revisit that.
So I mean, there's the logistics to that as well that I heard from a lot of folks. If you test early in the year, you don't have the full year of school to judge kids on. If you test them at the end of the year, you have kids with their graduation and promotion hanging in the balance until the last week of school. Like, do you want them to test kids in June and turn grades around in a week? Like, what do you want as the timing for the test and then the results getting back to you for them to be most useful and most accurate?
Well, I don't know about the superintendent, but I got my kids got their test scores back in early August. So I assume the department had them all handy. And again, most of this stuff is all on computers today. You throw it in an Access database and you spit out a number. I mean, I don't think it's reinventing the wheel or the moonshot or anything. I do, as for changing the report card, I think the department's doing a good job of stepping back and figuring out what should we be telling people on the report card. They just came out with a 5-year plan, and I think it's headed in the right direction. But I do think that we need, if you talk to any teacher, my parents are both teachers, and I ask them this all the time. I said, what's the most important thing a kid can learn? Is it, how to conjugate a verb? Is it to, how to work a derivative? And they said, no, the most important thing that they can learn is to love to learn. And we just don't measure that at all, and we don't even try. And there are people who have gone out there and done tools and measurements and those kinds of things. So I can envision a report card where you see, kids who come into this school are inspired to learn at a certain level, and when they leave, they're much more inspired, or they're not quite as inspired, or something like that, because the average kid who's getting out of high school today is going to end up having 10 to 12 jobs. So what they're going to need to do is have critical thinking, and when something new comes along, they'll tackle it and they'll undertake a new career. If you had told me when I graduated high school that I would be an education policy person, I would have said, "What are you talking about? I don't even know what that is." And so, again, I think it's key that we measure the things that kids actually need in order to survive in this wild and woolly 21st century gig economy. And the way to do that is to make sure that they love learning, and their curiosity will be piqued, and they'll learn on their own. And I think that's the most important tool any school district can teach a kid. Yeah, they got to know how to add numbers, and they got to know how to work derivatives. I lost that talent many years ago. But I mean, they got to know all that stuff, sure. But I think the most important thing we can teach them is the lifelong love of learning and curiosity. That's what's allowed. We have never, as a country, we have never scored well on international tests, ever. Yet we have dominated the world's culture, economy for going on 50, 60 years. I mean, this is, and we're not doing it in spite of the public education system. I think we're doing it a lot because of the public education system, and the education that we provided our kids has been top-notch and world-class, and that's why a lot of people want to come here and learn. And I think a lot of countries are learning from us. So I think it's very important that we, whatever we do to the report card, we make sure that the most important things that kids need are what's measured, not what's easiest to measure.
All right, so Chad, what did you want to add to that?
So I did not know Patrick was going to ask the question, but I brought a prop, and that is we wrote a report in December of last year called Back to the Basics about what our recommendations were to change the state report card. Essentially, in a nutshell, reduce the number of graded measures on the state report card from 15 down to 6. There's too many things graded. Too many people are using it as a hammer to attack schools and say, well, 94% of schools got a D or an F. Well, on one of the 15 grades, we all have weaknesses. That doesn't make you bad. We want to look at the overall and get the full picture. So we recommend keeping the data, just not grading all of it, putting it in a much simpler format. As I mentioned earlier, weighting growth more heavily, so student learning gains count more when calculating school grades. And then, let's see. Also getting rid of some of the measures that have been structured in a way that everybody fails. There were a couple measures last year where 80 to 90% of school districts and school buildings got Ds and Fs. Well, if that's the problem, it might not be the school's problem, it might be your measure. So those are some of what we like to think of as common sense recommendations to try to improve the state report card. And
I do want to say that there is one thing that I think No Child Left Behind has been really good at, and that is getting districts who usually ignored their poor, minority, disabled populations. Now they suddenly got to pay attention to them, even if they've got 15 kids that are disabled or poor or whatever. When I was in Columbus, I can't tell you how many times I had wealthy suburban districts come to me complaining about how they're getting graded and judged based on their very small minority populations. I think it's important that they're paying attention to those kids now. I think that's a nice outgrowth of that. But again, I do think that the report card needs to reflect what the kids experience in the school district. Not necessarily, just a couple of scores that they take for a few days out of many.
So we've got an awful lot of questions from folks out there. I think people have a lot of issues that they care a lot about. One of the repeated patterns I'm getting from the questions is the impact on the community to housing values when scores come out poor, about the bad scores and bad grades on report cards leading to increased segregation. Some folks here are comparing it to almost redlining areas. So I'm curious what each of you thinks about that. Is that that's perceived by some folks as an unintended consequence of the report cards. Can that be avoided? Should it be avoided?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword because, of course, if your property values go down, what do your local property taxes do? That funds primarily schools. What do? They go down. And I see that. I don't see that just in the urban areas. I see it in my hometown. I live in Greene, which is a very high-performing school district in southern Summit County. Right next door is Springfield, which is a poor white district, but they do not score as well as we do. There's a line of houses that are very nice homes. One side is in Springfield, one side's in Greene. The homes in Springfield are $40,000 less than the ones in Greene. There is no other reason for that. They all have the same, tie-ins to sewers and all that kind of stuff. The only difference is the schools. It's an incredibly important factor. It is the #1 factor why parents move their children across the country even. It's the number one factor. I like that it's the #1 factor, that parents care enough to actually physically move so that their kids can have an educational experience. But I think Chad and I and everyone up here believes that no matter where you are, you should receive a world-class education. But when you do have when you have an accountability system that says this school district isn't very good and this school district right next door is awesome, guess where you're moving, and guess what happens to your property values in the other school. That is a problem that is exacerbated in Ohio because Ohio relies so much on property taxes to pay for schools. That's a whole other topic. But when we do an accountability system in this state that is so dependent on local support for schools, we really have to make sure that accountability system is giving an accurate picture of what's going on in the schools so that, frankly, the people who are paying for it get a good idea of what's going on.
So I would just add that school quality has for decades, long before school report cards have been a factor in real estate values, property values, where people moved, where people lived. So the idea that it's something new, I don't think is there. Is it exacerbated some by school report cards? Probably. And the goal though with school report cards is to have the transparency, to have a focus on improving outcomes, trying to get kids into great schools. And but it's not. This isn't a new problem. It's certainly not caused by the problems that were suggested are not caused by school grades.
Yeah. But we don't have a solution of how we move forward, though, and I think that's the issue. So you have schools that have a certain designation, and you don't get out of that. So 2014, we had a different test. We had a new test in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And then what happened in 2015?
New test.
And then what happened in 2016?
New test.
No.
Well,
we changed one time.
One time.
It didn't work, and we adopted a new test.
Right. There's something wrong with that. Right, and so when you think
we could have kept with the test that wasn't very good.
Well, it's something wrong with that. Now, Cleveland Heights is one of 16 inner ring suburbs, so we're surrounding Cleveland. So we see a lot of students that are gone from CMSD to not only Cleveland Heights, but the surrounding districts. So how do we account for that on a test score and preparing those students? And then we still have these same, we're held to the same standards as our neighbors and getting these students ready. But we have students that are moving in and students that are going out, and then we're getting these grades. And of course, people looking, do we want to come to Cleveland Heights? Well, I'm not sure. They got an F on a report card again. Well, we had a different test again. We're preparing different students. I mean, we got to find a way to wrap ourselves around it and to do a fair assessment.
Isn't this year 3 of the current test? So so at least we're past this constant change for the ones that come out soon.
You may be past the constant change, but do you know the realities for our community? So in our community, yes, you may have the same test for 3 years, but do we have the same students that have been in front of our teachers for the same consistent 3 years? The answer is no. In some sense you do, in some that you don't. So each community is different, and I think there has to be a way to account for that.
Yeah.
And what that looks like, I'm not sure, but it has to be a way to account for that.
And you're seeing that not just in, you know, the urban core, or the
Correct.
urban rings. You're
Right.
seeing that in suburban districts. My wife went to Boardman. How many of you are from Youngstown? Anybody?
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Go Valley. When my wife went to Boardman, it was a very different district from what it is today. Today it is much more diverse. It's much less wealthy, and the scores reflect that. Now, you know, her maid of honor from her wedding teaches now in Boardman. So they went to Boardman. Now she teaches there, which is awesome, I guess. But she's sending her kids to Boardman, even though she lives next door in Poland, which is a more highly rated district, because she knows what's going on in those classrooms. So again, this is a complicated issue.
Yeah.
This is a very difficult issue.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems with the A through F system is it tries to boil everything down to a letter grade. As you can hear from all of us up here, it's much more complicated than that.
Right.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with complication with this kind of a difficult decision about where to send your kids to school, where to move. You should have everything you need to know in order to make that kind of a decision, because it is a life-altering decision. And to just boil it down to a letter, I think is
Right, and the school
not
districts
good.
shouldn't be in a position where they're constantly defending, why their schools are great, and we shouldn't be in that position. We have our quality profiles. Get all the school districts' quality profiles. You see all the great things that are happening in our schools. You're seeing schools focusing on this whole notion of measuring what matters. Communities are coming together and saying, these are the things that are important to us, and we're going to focus on measuring those things. And I think those are positive things. But as you see, more and more communities are moving away from focusing on this test culture. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to sit and have our kids come and say, okay, Johnny, you're new to Cleveland Heights. You're going to focus these many hours on making sure you pass that test. That shouldn't be what any community has to focus on.
And I just, something personal, my 8th grader has had test anxiety now for 5 years.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good outcome for our kids. Right. Now, he is an anxious kid by nature, but he would break down during tests and those kinds of things. I do fear that reportion that has been reported in a lot of places, that's kind of a side effect of this test culture.
So we've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to want to move through questions quickly. So since we're just dealing with test anxiety, so I've got two different kinds of questions from folks about tests and how kids view them. So there's test anxiety that can affect how kids do on the test and affects the culture of the school. And I hear other folks expressing concerns that how valid are tests if kids don't care about the test and there's no repercussions for them if they don't do well. Any quick thoughts on how you would balance that?
My school gives out, takes their high-performing kids out to Dairy Queen after the test. I mean, so again, or one of the teachers actually took him to a roller rink to celebrate taking the test, to give him an incentive. But of course, she did it out of her own pocket. So you've got a teacher paying to send 25 kids to a roller rink. Teachers in green do okay, but come on now. So again, the other thing with high stakes testing, we've seen this happen around the country, is it just begs for cheating.
Right, and it devalues.
It's a problem.
Yeah, it devalues the purpose of testing. No one even takes it seriously anymore in some sense, Yeah. So the purpose of it, when we think about monitoring and diagnosing, now we're getting to this high stakes testing. What do we have to do, and focusing on that. And we don't want to go into that culture where people are cheating.
No.
But what does the test even mean? Or do districts even value the validity of the information they've been receiving? Or they just get it, one point, look at it, oh well, put it on the shelf, and continue to focus on the curriculum that they've adopted in their district?
I think we should be careful that assessments and testing doesn't overwhelm the conversation as to the actual education.
I agree. Yeah.
Some of my favorite schools that if I could just move around and put my kids in different schools are actually ones that are getting C's. And when I ask them about the report card, they tell me that they really don't get any calls about it, and they really don't care. So they keep their eye on the bullseye. They do what they know is right and take care of their kids. And you can see these kids are thriving. They're doing amazing things in school, and they have a record of what these kids do after school. And yet these schools are getting C's. I was just amazed. So I think our report card also validates some of this excessive testing. And I think we should minimize it, because in the long run, this isn't what helps our kids learn better. It actually kind of teaches them how to comply.
Any thoughts?
I always have to speak after someone claps. I'm just the person up here trying to let the wind out of the sails, but everybody has a role to play. All right, so look, I think that question, as Patrick read it, I think hits on a couple things that are really important and that are there. For kids in grades 4 through 8, there aren't any stakes associated with it. So the only importance on it is what teachers, for the student, there are no stakes associated with the tests. So it is really about what mom and dad and the teacher and the principal put on those tests in terms of whether they take them seriously or not. In third grade, because of third grade reading guarantee, and in high school, because of end of course exams being required for graduation, it would be hard for them to have more stakes than they currently have. So it's sort of a balance, and I think that depending on the grade level you're in, what you see will vary widely. It used to be there were very little stakes for students on tests. Well, there were, but the Ohio graduation test, our precursor to the end of course exams, had extremely high passage rates. So it wasn't as big of an issue as the current tests and the end of course exams.
Okay, so we have a couple different questions about how value-added works, and then the individual needs of students that can affect how well they do in school. So I'll give my quick understanding of value-added, and then I'd like each of you to comment if your understanding is different or there are things you want to add. So, I mean, my understanding of value-added is it basically predicts where you would fall on a percentile rank of all the kids in Ohio on your test based on all your previous test scores. The general feeling has been that your past performance on tests would reflect all of the socioeconomic challenges that are affecting your school performance in your life, and then how you change on that percentile rank. If you move up in that rank, you're a plus in value added. If you move down in that rank, you're a minus in value added. That's a little bit oversimplified view of it, but that's the general feeling. From the perspective of the folks that developed this value-added model, the needs and the socioeconomic challenges of kids are reflected in it. The state has chosen not to add a specific measure of socioeconomic needs because they don't want to double count it. So they believe it's counted. There are other value-added models around the country that have specific adjustments based on socioeconomic characteristics of students. Anything you guys want to add about it that would, I guess, either add or detract from its validity and how we use it on the report cards?
No, I think that's a good descriptor of, at the high level, just sort of giving an overview of what it means. In terms of how it's used, when we did make the tests and have that 1 year of PARCC exams and then switch to an Ohio developed test 3 years ago now, the value-added scores became a little bit, they kind of oscillated back and forth. So you'd have districts that would go from A to F and F to A, and that just doesn't pass the smell test for a lot of people, because it's like, wait a second, I had the same kids, we had the same lesson plans, we were doing the same things, and I was an A one year and F the other year. Those are the exact questions when you see something like that that throws up red flags. And it was supposed to be, you know, in terms of your value added. So now we are moving to, now that we have more years of test data, it'll be a 3-year average of those test scores, so that you'll hopefully, if there are statistical variabilities, it's not, the grade isn't going to go crazy back and forth. Now, at the end of the day, you still want to get them right. The more students you have, one of the problems with our value-added thing, and this is how it's really complex, and it's why some of the large online charter schools, Steve mentioned ECOT earlier, have such huge negative value-added ratings. Because the number that goes in front of your value-added rating is a measure of certainty. It's a statistical measure of how sure are we you met learning gains or did not meet learning gains, rather than an actual quantity of the learning that happened or didn't happen. And that is the most complicated part. You know, long term, we may end up being better suited not having a value added be an A to F graded measure, but have it be like it used to be back in Steve's time, I think, in the General Assembly, where value added would add to your grade. So let's say you had a D, but then you had 2 years of value added gains, so you're a B. You know, you bump up a letter grade or two, and you know what? If you're an A, just because you have a very high wealth district and the kids all come ready and everybody's parents have a college degree, and they're going to pass the test, but they have very, very low value added and that they're not making much progress or much below what they're expected. Well, maybe they're going to have to get a B or a C. Well, maybe there's an adjustment associated.
Well, Chad, so you earlier you were advocating for using value added and growth measures more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So having it just be an add-on that moves your grade a little bit as opposed to something that determines the basis of the grade. So how do you reconcile those two? What would you if you had to pick one, what would you pick?
Legislative process. I think that's what he's.
Well, yeah, but he's got to go and speak to the legislators and nudge them for what he wants.
Let's get this. So he knows how it works.
Look, I think there are merits to both. That's a great question. What we need to do is, and my point in both of those statements is, we need to do a better job of using the value added in a way that creates a more accurate reflection of how much progress students are making. And I don't think we're good enough at that yet.
Yeah, I think that there are issues with value added. You can read about them wherever you want. But I do, when I look at value added and I compare the correlation with wealth, it is much less correlated with wealth, your grade on the value added portion than the straight proficiency portion. So it's moving in the right direction. There are issues with the calculation and everything. I don't want to bore anyone with that, but I do think that that idea that you should get points for I don't know, helping your kids. I think that's a good place to go.
Yeah.
I'm sure value added has value, but I think it's a good indicator for the Department of Education to know if there's schools that need help, and we could use that. But to use it on the report card, I think is wrong. If parents can't understand it, I don't think it should be on there.
Okay. So we've got a lot of other kind of scattered questions. We've got someone who's curious if test scores and report card grades are correlated much with the per child funding of each district, and whether schools with not a lot of money can compete with the wealthier ones. My understanding of that is it's not particularly correlated to the funding that's available, unless you want to look at the funding that's available related to the socioeconomic challenges that a district has. Some of them, actually in Ohio, some of the most highly funded districts are some of the poorest performing. Cleveland is got to be in the top 10% of all districts in terms of funding, and it's in the bottom 5% of all the districts in its scores. Is any thoughts about how we view report card grades and funding as it relates to socioeconomic issues tied together?
Yeah, this is a problem because one doesn't really beget the other. Right. The relationship is difficult to quantify. I will say that the districts that spend the most are Orange and Beechwood. They spend far more than Cleveland does. So if, by correlation then, if it's going to cost $22,000 a kid to educate a kid in Orange, get all those high scores in that very wealthy district, what's it going to cost in Cleveland? Right? Again, so I think that it's problematic to say, well, this district, they only spend $8,000 a kid, and look at their grades, but they spend $17,000 a kid in Cleveland, and look at how bad their grades are. Obviously, more money isn't helping. That's not. I don't think you can make that correlation. Yeah. I do think that there's some really good work that Howard Fleeter's done, who's a big school funding guru, about the actual funding that school districts have to spend discretionarily, if that's a word, where because the urban districts in particular, and even the poor Appalachian districts, a lot of their spending is dictated by federal rules and Title I and all that kind of stuff. They have a lot less discretionary funding with which to develop their programming than, say, a wealthy suburban district does. So when you control for that, Cleveland expenditures are actually pretty low in terms of discretionary funding. So again, I think it's a very, school funding is a whole different issue. Yeah. But I think when you equate funding with test scores, it's a little bit problematic. Do I think that test scores might grow if you if you invest in teachers and training and that kind of thing? Sure. But I'm not sure that it's only going to be a couple $100 a kid.
So, Chad, any thoughts on that as our main voice from the right?
No, I mean, I think I don't think there's a clear correlation. I mean, it'd be nice if we could say that there was, but I have not seen any evidence that there's a clear correlation. You're going to find what will look like a relatively efficient district that gets great grades and spends very little, and then you can see, and then you can see districts that get great grades that spend a lot. And so I don't think you can tell. The one thing I would say, and this is not a school funding discussion, but we give a very little bump for economically disadvantaged students. And I think that if we get a new funding formula coming up, which every governor promises, so soon enough you'll be hearing the promises, whichever one is elected, we've got to fix it. But moving to really having a much larger bump for economically disadvantaged students, and changing it maybe from FRL, that 185% of poverty, the free and reduced price lunch level, to truly poverty. Families with an income of $22,000 to $24,000 or below, I think might be able to really drive resources where the greatest educational disadvantage is. And I think that's something to look for, but that's outside the scope of report card.
Sure. Well, like one of the things I mentioned at the very start of my introduction is part of why we have the report cards is to see if we're giving equitable opportunities to people of all different races. And we're not really using report cards results, poor report card results in districts to drive additional funding and resources in a very big way to districts. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
That's why we need to do the scrap and rebuild, because first we have to make sure who is this for, and then we can come up with the measurements on how we're going to measure.
Yeah, and again, if the reaction of the General Assembly to bad grades is not, well, let's put more money in there for poverty. Unfortunately, it's the money we are spending there is wasted, and so I think it takes a sea change at the General Assembly to make that. And I'm not talking party. I'm just talking. This is something that's been going on since the '80s. So I mean, it's yeah.
Okay. So we've got a few other scattered questions here. So one of them is, how well can we define other measures of performance besides the test? there are different intelligences that students have. How do we determine whether schools are developing those? What can we do to measure all these other things? I mean, we've had the school board as a group. You came up with a much more holistic approach to looking at the goals of schools as a whole. And as from a lot of your discussions, there's lots about setting goals even though you don't know how we're going to measure them yet. Do we think there are really good measures to tell whether schools are meeting these things that we really want them to be able to do beyond the test?
There are ones out there. I mean, I've seen them in studies and dissertations and other things. There are measures out there. I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is commit to trying, and then do it, and not, we in 2009 we did House Bill 1, which was the evidence-based model, which I won't get into. But during that discussion, one of the things we were going to fund was a lot of the quote-unquote soft skills that we were going to fund, and boy, did we catch heat for that. I'm glad that the department is now pushing this, 10 years later, but I do hope that there's a recognition, the business community recognizes the importance of those skills. I think that the economy demands that kids know these skills, know how to work in teams, know how to, develop their emotional intelligence, all this kind of stuff. Learn creativity, and I think that's incredibly important. And I'm glad that the department is taking a lead role on that and saying that this is something that we need to do. Now it's up to convincing the General Assembly to fund it. Good luck.
Okay, so I think we're probably about time, or we just got a couple more minutes. Let me see. So one question, do we have any really good examples of folks in Ohio who've improved their scores on report cards to a certain degree and to a significant degree and sustained that success? Do we know of any? With failing results and then moved up in a major way?
I think the challenge is we have no.
You're in Cleveland, Chad, not Cincinnati.
What? I don't even know what I said.
No, I'm kidding. Nothing.
Okay. So I think the challenge is we haven't had a consistent report card. We had the report card up until no. Well, now, by the way, if it was up to me, we would have had a consistent report card. But the legislature put in hold harmless language 3 or 4 years ago where no school grades counted. And that was what they thought was the fairest way to treat things. And, I respect that. You want things to be fair when you're evaluating schools. But because of that, you did not have, there isn't a long history track record. I also think it's harder to move districts, and we mostly will focus on district grades. I think individual school buildings, I'm sure there have been successes. I don't know of anybody who's documented them. I do know there's a couple of charter schools that started, Citizens Academy comes to mind in Cleveland, that its first couple years, it was just on the cusp of being closed for automatic closure, and then turned into a really strong charter school in Cleveland. So it can be done. I think it's easier to do it at a school level rather than changing entire districts, because like everything in education, the people in the building, the principals, the teachers, that's what's going to make a tremendous difference, far more than state policy does.
Well, I've seen. This predates the report card, but there are school districts that when I was growing up were not considered very high performing, or weren't places you wanted to go, like Nordonia in Summit County, that's now very highly rated, but that's because a lot of rich people moved there. Right. So again, it's I agree with Chad. It's a lot easier to improve performance in a building than a district overall, just because of how the district calculus is made. But there are school districts that are able to move up a beat, maybe 2. But again, I think that one of the problems with the report card is many districts don't really have a realistic shot in an A. So, you know, however much they try, because of the data that's inputted, is so closely tied with economic realities, it's going to be very difficult for them to go up that high.
And I think the other concern is if you do find a district that does move up, it's going to change the next year.
Yeah.
Because something on the report card.
They have to learn a new dance.
Exactly. So the sustainability. I don't know of an example for you.
I mean, I
but
think
if there was an example and it changes, go ahead.
On the old report cards, you know, I think districts after several years started to see some improvements, and then they fell back with the new tests, and then it fell back again. And so, but I do think that if you keep the same regime in place and you keep the same goalposts, I think schools are very good at adjusting to those over a couple of 3 years. I agree with the legislature that, you know, I don't agree with them a whole lot, but I do agree with them that they should, you know, while they were making these adjustments to the report card, having it not count, I think is really kind of the only fair thing to do. But I do think that if you keep the rules of the road the same, I think a lot of really, you know, great educational leaders and teachers and specialists and those kinds of things are really going to adjust to that, and I think you will see improvements. But again, I do think that there is some stuff cooked into it that makes it really problematic.
Okay, well, very good. If anybody has specific questions for any of the panelists, come on up. I think people will be around for a few more minutes. But thank you all for coming out tonight.